A single hiking boot. Weather-beaten, dirt-caked, with laces still tied in a perfect bow. After 3 years of searching Colorado's wilderness, this was all that remained of Sarah Chen, until forensic experts looked closer and discovered something that would turn a missing person case into the most shocking conspiracy the Rocky Mountains had ever seen. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. October 15, 2021. The aspen leaves painted Colorado mountainsides in brilliant golds and crimsons, creating a postcard-perfect backdrop that drew thousands of hikers to the Maroon Bells Wilderness area. Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old environmental lawyer from Denver, had made this trek dozens of times before. She knew every switchback, every rocky outcropping, every place where the trail narrowed along the cliff's edge. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Sarah laced up her well-worn hiking boots in the parking lot at Maroon Lake. The familiar ritual, double knots, checking her GPS watch, adjusting her day pack, had become second nature over her 8 years of serious hiking. Her boyfriend, Marcus Rivera, watched from the driver's seat of their Subaru, sipping coffee from a thermos that steamed in the 6 a.m. chill. "Text me when you reach the summit," Marcus called out, his breath visible in small, white puffs. It was their routine. Sarah would tackle the challenging trails solo, while Marcus preferred the comfort of their weekend cabin, working on his photography equipment and preparing elaborate dinners for her return. "Always do," Sarah replied, flashing that confident smile that had first caught his attention 3 years earlier at a Sierra Club meeting. She shouldered her pack, the familiar weight of her emergency supplies settling against her spine. Water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency blanket, whistle. Sarah never took chances in the backcountry. The trailhead was nearly empty at this early hour. Only dedicated hikers ventured out before dawn, seeking solitude and pristine beauty that came with beating the crowds. Sarah's headlamp cut through the pre-dawn darkness as she began her ascent, her boots finding rhythm on the well-worn path. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of frozen leaves beneath her feet and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the peaks. But what started as Sarah's routine solo adventure would become something far more sinister. By nightfall, when her usual check-in text never arrived, Marcus would be pacing their cabin floor, cell phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with frantic park rangers. Within 48 hours, search and rescue teams would be combing every inch of the Maroon Bells trail system, following false leads and dead ends that seemed to lead nowhere. For 3 agonizing years, Sarah Chen would remain Colorado's most puzzling missing person case. Her family would plaster her photo on missing person websites, hire private investigators, and never stop believing she was still alive somewhere. The case would go cold, filed away in the presumed dead category that haunts every law enforcement agency. But sometimes, the mountains keep their secrets until they're ready to reveal the truth. And when that truth finally surfaced, it would be more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The first 48 hours after Sarah's disappearance unfolded like a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Marcus Rivera stood at the edge of Maroon Lake, watching search and rescue teams methodically comb through the dense undergrowth with the precision of surgeons. Their orange vests moved like fireflies through the autumn landscape, each searcher following grid patterns that had been perfected over decades of mountain rescues. Detective Linda Vasquez arrived at the trailhead as the sun crested the peaks, casting long shadows across the parking lot, where Sarah's planned route still lay marked in red ink on Marcus's trail map. The veteran investigator had seen dozens of missing hiker cases, but something about this one felt different. Sarah's preparation was meticulous. Her emergency contacts were updated, her gear was professional grade, and her experience level made the typical explanations seem inadequate. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead, drowning out the voices of the growing crowd of volunteers who had responded to the emergency broadcast. Local news crews positioned themselves behind the yellow tape, their cameras capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Sarah's parents, Dr. James and Linda Chen, had driven through the night from Boulder, arriving with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands that clutched recent photos of their daughter. By the second day, the search radius had expanded to cover nearly 15 square miles of rugged terrain. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that seemed to vanish into thin air near the tree line, their frustrated whimpering echoing off the granite cliffs. The dogs would circle back to the same spot repeatedly, a small clearing approximately 2 miles up the main trail, before losing the trail completely, as if Sarah had simply evaporated into the Colorado wilderness. Marcus found himself walking the same section of trail obsessively, his eyes scanning for any sign. A piece of fabric caught on a branch, a footprint in the soft earth, anything that might explain how an experienced hiker could simply disappear. The repetitive crunch of his boots on the fallen leaves became a meditation, a desperate ritual that kept the growing panic at bay. The search coordinator, a weathered man named Tom Bradley, who had coordinated rescues in these mountains for over 20 years, pulled Detective Vasquez aside on the third day. His expression carried the weight of difficult news, the kind that families never want to hear, but investigators must eventually deliver. "We've covered every accessible area within a 10-mile radius," Bradley explained, his voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to howl through the aspen groves. "The dogs keep coming back to that same clearing, but there's nothing there. No signs of struggle, no blood, no equipment. It's like she just stopped existing." But what the searchers didn't know was that someone had been watching their every move from a concealed position high above the search area. Through high-powered binoculars, calculating eyes tracked the search team's movements, noting their patterns, their blind spots, their growing frustration. This observer had been expecting this moment for months, had planned for exactly this scenario. And now, as the official search began to wind down, the real work could begin. The mountains were about to reveal their first secret. But it wouldn't be Sarah Chen. 6 months after Sarah's disappearance, the case file had grown thick with dead ends and false leads. Detective Vasquez spread the contents across her desk in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, each document representing another sleepless night for Sarah's family, another theory that had crumbled under investigation. The organized search had officially ended after 2 weeks, but the informal searches continued. Every weekend, Marcus would return to the Maroon Bells area with different groups of volunteers, Sarah's law firm colleagues, members of her hiking club, strangers who had been moved by her story on social media. They would fan out across the wilderness, calling her name until their voices were hoarse, photographing every unusual rock formation or hidden cave that might conceal answers. Sarah's parents had hired 3 different private investigators, each promising breakthrough results that never materialized. The most recent investigator, a former FBI profiler named David Walsh, had spent weeks analyzing Sarah's digital footprint, looking for any sign of distress or unusual behavior in the months before her disappearance. Her bank records showed regular purchases at outdoor gear stores. Her social media posts documented dozens of successful hikes, and her cell phone data revealed nothing more suspicious than late-night conversations with Marcus and work-related calls. The psychological profile Walsh developed painted Sarah as methodical, safety-conscious, and deeply connected to the Colorado outdoors community. She wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks, and she certainly wasn't someone who would stage her own disappearance. Every piece of evidence pointed to a woman who had simply vanished without explanation. Detective Vasquez had reviewed security footage from every business along the route to the trailhead, interviewed every hiker who had been in the area that day, and followed up on dozens of reported sightings from across the state. A woman matching Sarah's description had allegedly been seen at a gas station in Grand Junction, hiking alone near Rocky Mountain National Park, and even boarding a bus in Denver. Each lead had been thoroughly investigated and dismissed. The ID case that haunted Vasquez the most involved the clearing where the bloodhounds had repeatedly lost Sarah's scent. Forensic teams had excavated the area, analyzed soil samples, and even brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment. The results were always the same. Nothing unusual, no signs of disturbance, no explanation for why an experienced hiker's trail would simply end in the middle of an unremarkable patch of forest. Winter had transformed the Maroon Bells into an impenetrable fortress of snow and ice, effectively ending any hope of continuing the search until spring. The harsh weather had likely destroyed any remaining evidence, buried any clues under several feet of Colorado powder. Sarah's case joined the growing file of cold cases that accumulated in mountain communities, people who had walked into the wilderness and never returned. But in a small cabin tucked away in a remote valley 30 miles from the Maroon Bells, someone was watching the news coverage of Sarah's case with intense interest. This person had been patient, methodical, waiting for the initial investigation to run its course. The maps pinned to the cabin wall showed detailed topographical information about dozens of hiking trails throughout Colorado, and several locations were marked with red pins. Sarah's disappearance site was just one of many. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the mountain landscape once again, this watcher knew it was time to escalate the plan. Sarah Chen had been the beginning, not the end. What if her disappearance was just the first piece of an even bigger puzzle? The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in May, 14 months after Sarah's disappearance. Detective Vasquez was reviewing witness statements for another case when her desk phone rang with an urgent tone that made her stomach clench. The caller was Detective Mike Torres from the Garfield County Sheriff's Office, and his voice carried the weight of terrible news. "We've got another missing hiker," Torres said without preamble. 28-year-old male, experienced backpacker, disappeared 3 days ago from the Hanging Lake Trail. But here's the thing that's got me calling you. The circumstances are almost identical to your Sarah Chen case. The victim's name was Kevin Martinez, a software engineer from Colorado Springs who had been hiking solo in the Glenwood Canyon area. Like Sarah, he was meticulously prepared, had informed his roommate of his planned route, and had simply vanished without a trace. The search dogs had followed his scent to a small clearing approximately 2 miles from the trailhead before losing it completely. No signs of struggle, no equipment left behind, no explanation for how an experienced hiker could simply disappear. Vasquez felt the familiar chill of recognition as Torres described the case details. The similarities weren't just coincidental, they were deliberate. Someone was targeting experienced hikers, people who knew the wilderness well enough to avoid typical dangers, people whose disappearances would be attributed to tragic accidents rather than foul play. Within hours, Vasquez was driving toward Glenwood Springs, her mind racing through the implications. If Kevin Martinez's disappearance was connected to Sarah's, it meant they were dealing with something far more sinister than a single missing person case. It meant someone was hunting people in Colorado's wilderness areas, using the vast and unforgiving landscape as both weapon and accomplice. The crime scene at Hanging Lake felt eerily familiar. The same methodical search patterns, the same frustrated expressions on the search and rescue team's faces, the same desperate family members clutching photographs and hoping for miracles. Detective Torres walked Vasquez through the timeline, pointing out the exact spot where Kevin's trail had gone cold. But it was the discovery of a small piece of fabric caught on a tree branch that made Vasquez's blood run cold. The fabric was bright orange, the same color as the jacket Sarah had been wearing when she disappeared. Torres had already sent it for analysis, but both detectives knew what they were looking at. Evidence of a connection between two cases separated by over a year and hundreds of miles. That evening, Vasquez returned to her hotel room and spread detailed maps across the small table. She marked Sarah's disappearance site with a red pin, then added Kevin's location. The distance between them formed an almost perfect triangle with the geographic center of Colorado. If there was a third disappearance, she suspected it would complete a pattern that would reveal the predator's hunting ground. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message contained only GPS coordinates and a single word: soon. Vasquez screenshot the message immediately and called the state police to report the potential threat. But when they tried to trace the number, it led to a burner phone that had already been discarded. As she studied the maps late into the night, Vasquez began to understand that they weren't just dealing with random disappearances. Someone was orchestrating these events with military precision, choosing victims who fit a specific profile, locations that provided natural camouflage for their activities, and timing that would ensure maximum confusion for law enforcement. The realization that hit her as she finally turned off the lights was perhaps the most terrifying of all. If this person was escalating, if they were becoming bolder and more confident, then Sarah Chen and Kevin Martinez might still be alive. And if they were alive, they were somewhere in Colorado's vast wilderness, waiting for someone to piece together the clues that would lead to their rescue. But what really happened to these experienced hikers in those isolated clearings? The call Vasquez had been dreading came exactly 3 weeks after Kevin Martinez's disappearance. Detective Rachel Stone from the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office reported a missing hiker from the Mount Evans Wilderness area, a 31-year-old nurse named Amanda Foster, who had vanished under circumstances that were now becoming sickeningly familiar. Vasquez arrived at the Mount Evans trailhead as the sun was setting behind the 14,000-foot peaks, casting long shadows across the alpine landscape. The search teams had been working for 2 days, following the same frustrating pattern that had defined the previous cases. Amanda's scent trail led to a clearing roughly 2 miles from the parking area, where it simply vanished as if she had been lifted into thin air. Detective Stone was younger than Vasquez, but her eyes held the hardened expression of someone who had seen too much violence in her short career. She led Vasquez to the exact spot where the search dogs had lost Amanda's trail, a small meadow surrounded by dense pine forest that looked identical to the clearings where Sarah and Kevin had disappeared. The ranger found this about 50 yards from where the scent goes cold, Stone said, holding up an evidence bag containing a small silver pendant. Amanda's sister confirmed it's hers. She never took it off. Vasquez examined the pendant through the clear plastic. It was a small compass rose, the kind of jewelry that experienced hikers often wore as both decoration and functional equipment. But what caught her attention was the way the chain had been cut. Not torn or broken in a struggle, but cleanly severed with sharp tools. The pattern was now undeniable. 3 experienced hikers, all disappearing from remote wilderness areas, all vanishing from similar clearings approximately 2 miles from trailheads. The geographic distribution formed a perfect triangle with each point roughly 70 miles apart, encompassing some of Colorado's most popular hiking destinations. As the search for Amanda continued into its 3rd day, Vasquez worked with a state police analyst to create a comprehensive profile of their suspect. The precision of the disappearances suggested military or law enforcement training. The geographic pattern indicated intimate knowledge of Colorado's wilderness areas, and the victim selection showed a predator who was careful, patient, and methodical. But it was the discovery of a carefully concealed trail camera that provided their first real breakthrough. A volunteer searcher had noticed something unusual about a tree trunk near Amanda's disappearance site. A small lens, barely visible behind. Specially crafted bark camouflage. The camera had been positioned to capture anyone entering or leaving the clearing, and its memory card contained footage that made Vasquez's stomach turn. The video showed Amanda approaching the clearing at approximately 2:30 p.m. on the day she disappeared. She appeared relaxed, stopping to adjust her backpack and check her GPS watch. But at 2:47 p.m., a figure in military-style camouflage emerged from the tree line behind her. The person moved with practiced stealth, approaching Amanda from her blind spot while she was examining something on the ground. The footage ended abruptly at 2:48 p.m., but it had captured enough to confirm their worst fears. They weren't dealing with accidental disappearances or even opportunistic crimes. Someone was hunting people in Colorado's wilderness with the precision of a trained predator, and they had been operating undetected for over a year. That night, as Vasquez reviewed the camera footage for the dozenth time, she noticed something that chilled her to the bone. In the final seconds before the recording stopped, the camouflaged figure had looked directly at the camera and raised a gloved hand in what appeared to be a mocking wave. Their predator knew about the investigation. More terrifyingly, they wanted to be found. The message was clear. The game was escalating, and 3 missing hikers were just the beginning of something much more sinister than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired geology professor named Dr. Emily Watson, who had been following the missing hiker cases on local news. She contacted Detective Vasquez with information that would completely reshape their understanding of how 3 people could vanish without a trace from Colorado's wilderness areas. Dr. Watson had spent 40 years studying Colorado's underground cave systems, mapping an intricate network of natural and abandoned mining tunnels that honeycombed the Rocky Mountain region. When she saw the geographic pattern of the disappearances on television, she recognized something that law enforcement had missed. All 3 locations sat directly above extensive underground cave systems that connected across hundreds of miles. Vasquez met Dr. Watson at the university's geology lab, where detailed topographical maps covered every available wall surface. The professor's weathered hands traced underground passages that snaked beneath the Maroon Bells, Hanging Lake, and Mount Evans areas, forming a subterranean highway that could allow someone to move undetected across vast distances. These caves have been used for everything from Native American ceremonies to Prohibition-era smuggling operations, Dr. Watson explained, pointing to hand-drawn notations that marked dozens of hidden entrances. Most people don't realize that you can walk underground from Glenwood Springs to Boulder if you know the right passages. The cave system explained how their predator could approach victims undetected and remove them from the wilderness without leaving traditional forensic evidence. But it also suggested something far more disturbing. If Sarah, Kevin, and Amanda had been taken underground, they could be anywhere within a network that spanned hundreds of square miles. Vasquez immediately organized a specialized cave rescue team, but Dr. Watson's expression remained grim as she reviewed the tactical plans. The underground passages were treacherous, even for experienced cavers, with unstable rock formations, toxic gases from old mining operations, and sections that flooded during spring snowmelt. Searching the entire network would take years and risk the lives of every rescue team member. But the cave theory explained other mysterious aspects of the case that had puzzled investigators. The surgical precision of the disappearances, The complete absence of surface evidence and the predator's apparent ability to monitor law enforcement activities all made sense if they were dealing with someone who had turned Colorado's underground world into their personal hunting preserve. 3 days into the cave search operation, the team made their first significant discovery. In a chamber roughly 50 feet below Amanda Foster's disappearance site, they found evidence of recent human habitation: sleeping bags, canned food, and a camping stove that was still warm to the touch. Someone had been using this underground location as a base of operations, coming and going through passages that connected to the surface through carefully concealed entrances. But it was the discovery of personal items that made the search team's blood run cold. Amanda's hiking boots sat neatly arranged near one of the sleeping bags, along with Sarah's distinctive water bottle and Kevin's GPS watch. The items were positioned like trophies, carefully preserved and displayed for maximum psychological impact. The chamber also contained detailed maps of Colorado's hiking trail systems with dozens of locations marked in red ink. Most terrifyingly, several of the marked locations showed recent surveillance photos of potential victims, hikers who had no idea they were being stalked by someone who moved through the underground world like a predator through its natural habitat. As the cave team documented the evidence, Vasquez realized they had stumbled into something far more extensive than 3 isolated disappearances. The maps and photographs suggested a criminal operation that had been active for years, possibly decades, using Colorado's wilderness areas as hunting grounds and its underground cave systems as invisible infrastructure. But where were Sarah, Kevin, and Amanda? The personal items suggested they had been brought to this chamber, but there was no sign of the victims themselves. The cave system branched in dozens of directions, leading deeper underground toward destinations that could only be explored by experienced cavers willing to risk their lives in the search for 3 people who might already be dead. What secrets were hidden in the deepest parts of Colorado's underground world? The cave rescue team descended deeper into Colorado's underground labyrinth, following passages that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Led by veteran caver John Mitchell, the team navigated through chambers that varied from cathedral-sized caverns to crawl spaces barely wide enough for a single person. Their headlamps cut through absolute darkness, revealing limestone formations that had been shaped by millions of years of water flow. Detective Vasquez had insisted on joining the underground search, despite having no cave experience. The psychological profile of their predator suggested someone who thrived on control and isolation, and she suspected that understanding their underground domain was crucial to anticipating their next move. Every step deeper into the cave system brought new evidence that someone had been using these passages for years. The team discovered a series of supply caches positioned at strategic intervals throughout the cave network. Military-style storage. Containers held food, water, medical supplies, and sophisticated communication equipment that allowed someone to monitor law enforcement radio frequencies from deep underground. The level of organization suggested they were dealing with someone who had transformed the cave system into a fully operational base of operations. But it was the discovery of a makeshift laboratory that provided the most disturbing insights into their predators' activities. Hidden in a natural chamber approximately 200 feet below the surface, the lab contained equipment for analyzing blood samples, testing soil composition, and monitoring seismic activity. Detailed logs showed measurements and observations dating back over 5 years, suggesting a long-term research project that used the missing hikers as test subjects. Dr. Watson, who had joined the underground expedition as a technical advisor, examined the laboratory equipment with growing horror. The blood analysis equipment was designed to test for specific genetic markers, while the soil testing apparatus was calibrated to detect human decomposition at various depths. The implications were clear. Their predator wasn't just collecting victims, They were conducting experiments on them. The deeper chambers revealed evidence of previous victims that law enforcement had never connected to the recent disappearances. Personal items from hikers who had gone missing across multiple states were carefully catalogued and stored in waterproof containers. Driver's licenses, jewelry, and camping equipment from victims spanning the past decade suggested a serial predator who had been operating across the Rocky Mountain region for years. But the most chilling discovery was a detailed journal documenting the predator's methodology. Written in precise handwriting, the entries described techniques for selecting victims, methods for avoiding detection, and detailed analysis of law enforcement response patterns. The journal revealed someone with intimate knowledge of search and rescue procedures, forensic investigation techniques, and the psychological profiles of both victims and investigators. One journal entry, dated just 3 days earlier, sent ice through Vasquez's veins. Law enforcement has discovered the primary cache site. Time to accelerate the timeline. The subjects have provided valuable data, but their usefulness is approaching. Termination. Relocation to Site 7 will commence immediately. Site 7. The team immediately consulted Dr. Watson's cave maps, identifying a chamber complex nearly 3 miles deeper into the underground system. The passage leading to Site 7 was marked with warnings about unstable rock formations and toxic gas concentrations from abandoned mining operations. It was a location that would be nearly impossible to reach without specialized equipment and extensive cave experience. As the team prepared for the dangerous journey to Site 7, they made one more discovery that changed the entire nature of their mission. Hidden beneath a loose rock formation, they found a communication device that was still receiving messages. The most recent transmission, sent less than 6 hours earlier, contained GPS coordinates and a simple message. Package delivery confirmed. Initiate final protocol. The coordinates corresponded to a location on the surface, a remote cabin, in the San Juan Mountains that was approximately 180 miles from their current position. Someone was coordinating the underground operations from above ground, and they were preparing to execute what the journal referred to as final protocol on Sarah, Kevin, and Amanda. Racing against time through treacherous underground passages, the team pressed toward Site 7, knowing that 3 lives depended on their ability to navigate Colorado's underground world faster than the predator who had been using it as their private hunting preserve for years. But what would they find in the deepest darkness of Site 7? The journey to Site 7 tested every skill the cave rescue team possessed. They navigated through passages flooded with knee-deep water that had seeped down from the spring snowmelt, crawled through spaces so narrow that equipment had to be passed through separately, and rappelled down vertical drops that plunged into seemingly bottomless darkness. The air grew thinner and more toxic as they descended, forcing the team to rely on portable oxygen supplies that had to be carefully rationed. After 8 hours of treacherous underground travel, they finally reached the entrance to Site 7. The chamber beyond was unlike anything Dr. Watson had documented in her decades of cave exploration. It was a natural cathedral carved from limestone, with soaring walls that disappeared into darkness beyond their headlamp's reach. But what made the team's blood run cold was the evidence of extensive human modification. The chamber had been transformed into a sophisticated holding facility. Steel bars had been anchored into the rock walls, creating 3 separate cells that were just large enough for a single person. Sleeping bags, water containers, and chemical toilets showed that people had been held here for extended periods. But most disturbing were the observation equipment and recording devices that had been positioned to monitor every corner of the makeshift prison. In the first cell, they found Sarah Chen. She was alive, but barely recognizable after nearly 2 years of captivity. Her once athletic frame had become gaunt from malnutrition, and her eyes held the hollow expression of someone who had endured psychological torture that most people couldn't imagine. When the rescuer's lights illuminated her face, she pressed herself against the far wall of the cell, terrified that her captors had returned. "Sarah, my name is Detective Vasquez," she said softly, approaching the cell with hands raised to show she wasn't armed. "We're here to get you out. You're safe now." Kevin Martinez and Amanda Foster were in the adjacent cells, both showing similar signs of prolonged captivity and psychological trauma. All three victims were conscious but severely dehydrated and malnourished. The cave rescue team immediately began emergency medical treatment, while Vasquez documented the crime scene, knowing that every detail would be crucial for the prosecution of whoever had orchestrated this nightmare. But it was Sarah who provided the most crucial information about their captor. Despite her weakened condition, she managed to communicate that their abductor was someone they never would have suspected. A person who had been involved in the search efforts for each missing hiker. Someone who had used their position of trust to gather intelligence about the investigation and stay ahead of law enforcement. "He was there," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible after months of disuse. "Every search, every press conference. He knew exactly what you were looking for because he was helping you look." The revelation sent shockwaves through the rescue team. Their predator hadn't been operating from outside the investigation. They had been embedded within it, using their access to inside information to stay steps ahead of every law enforcement effort. It explained how someone could orchestrate such sophisticated disappearances while avoiding detection for years. As the medical team stabilized the three victims for the dangerous journey back to the surface, Vasquez examined the observation equipment that had been used to monitor their captivity. The recording devices were still active, transmitting data to remote locations that could be anywhere within hundreds of miles. Whoever had been running this operation was likely watching their rescue efforts in real time, already preparing to disappear before law enforcement could close in. But Sarah's information about their captor's involvement in the search efforts provided the breakthrough Vasquez needed. She immediately contacted the State Police Coordination Center, requesting background checks on every search and rescue volunteer, private investigator, and law enforcement officer who had participated in all three missing person cases. The overlap was smaller than expected. Only 7 individuals had been directly involved in the search efforts for Sarah, Kevin, and Amanda. But one name stood out with chilling clarity: David Walsh, the private investigator that Sarah's parents had hired to find their daughter. He had intimate access to all 3 crime scenes, detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures, and the perfect cover story for his presence at every critical moment of the investigation. As the rescue team began the dangerous journey back through Colorado's underground maze, carrying 3 traumatized survivors who had endured nearly 2 years of captivity, Vasquez realized that their most trusted ally in the search for Sarah, Chen, had been the predator they were hunting all along. But if David Walsh was still receiving live feeds from Site 7, he knew that his operation had been compromised, and someone with his skills and resources wouldn't surrender without a fight. David Walsh's remote cabin in the San Juan Mountains had been abandoned in haste. When the tactical team arrived at the coordinates from the intercepted communication, they found evidence of a sophisticated operation that had been dismantled with military precision. Computer equipment had been destroyed beyond recovery, research files had been burned in a steel barrel outside the cabin, and any evidence that might have revealed the full scope of Walsh's activities had been systematically eliminated. But Walsh had made one crucial mistake in his hasty escape. He had left behind a detailed topographical map showing the entire cave network he had been using for his operations. The map contained markings for dozens of additional sites throughout Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, locations that suggested his activities had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Detective Vasquez studied the map with growing horror. Each marked location corresponded to areas where hikers had gone missing over the past decade, disappearances that had been attributed to accidents or animal attacks rather than foul play. The pattern suggested that Walsh had been operating a sophisticated kidnapping and experimentation network across multiple states, using his credentials as a private investigator to insert himself into missing person cases and redirect investigations away from the truth. The FBI had joined the manhunt, bringing resources and expertise that the local sheriff's departments couldn't match. Special Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in serial predator cases, reviewed Walsh's background and uncovered a disturbing history that had been hidden behind fabricated credentials and false references. The man Sarah's parents had trusted to find their daughter had been discharged from military service for psychological issues, had multiple restraining orders from former clients, and had been connected to unexplained disappearances in 3 other states. But Walsh's military training and intimate knowledge of law enforcement procedures made him a formidable fugitive. He had spent years studying search and rescue techniques not to help find missing people, but to understand how to avoid being found himself. The manhunt expanded across multiple states as evidence emerged that Walsh had prepared safe houses and supply caches throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Emily Watson, the geology professor who had helped identify the cave network, discovered something unusual in Walsh's abandoned map. Several locations were marked with symbols that didn't correspond to cave entrances or supply caches. When cross-referenced with historical mining records, these symbols indicated abandoned mines that had been sealed decades earlier due to toxic contamination. Agent Santos realized that Walsh wasn't just fleeing, he was retreating to prepared positions where he could continue his operations while evading capture. The sealed mines provided the perfect hiding places for someone with extensive underground experience and the technical knowledge to bypass safety systems designed to keep people out of contaminated areas. The tactical team descended into the Molybdenum King Mine, an abandoned operation near Leadville that had been sealed in 1987 due to dangerous levels of arsenic and lead contamination. The mine's original shaft extended over 800 feet underground, with lateral passages that honeycombed the mountainside. For someone like Walsh, who had spent years mapping Colorado's underground world, it represented the perfect fortress. The evidence they found in the mine's upper levels confirmed their worst fears about the scope of Walsh's operations. Detailed files documented experiments conducted on dozens of victims over nearly a decade. Medical equipment showed that Walsh had been testing the effects of various toxins and psychological stressors on his captives, treating human beings like laboratory subjects in research that served no scientific purpose beyond satisfying his sadistic curiosity. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of video recordings that documented Walsh's interactions with the families of missing people. The recordings showed him comforting grieving parents, while secretly documenting their emotional responses. For his psychological research, he had been studying the secondary victims of his crimes, the families destroyed by his actions, with the same clinical detachment he applied to his primary victims. As the tactical team prepared to descend deeper into the abandoned mine, they received intelligence that Walsh was no longer alone. Intercepted communications suggested he had made contact with other individuals who shared his interests, people who had been following his work and wanted to continue his research. The revelation that Walsh might be part of a larger network of predators transformed the operation from a manhunt into something far more complex and dangerous. The team's headlamps illuminated decades-old mining equipment as they descended toward the deepest levels of the Molybdenum King Mine, knowing that somewhere in the toxic darkness below, David Walsh was preparing for a final confrontation that would determine whether his years of experiments on innocent people would end with his capture or expand into something even more horrific. But what really drove someone to transform Colorado's wilderness into their personal hunting ground? The confrontation in the depths of the Molybdenum King mine revealed the true scope of David Walsh's operation. When the tactical team finally cornered him in a chamber 600 feet below ground, they discovered he wasn't alone. 3 other individuals had joined him in the abandoned mine, people who had been coordinating similar operations in different states, using Walsh's methodology to conduct their own experiments on missing hikers and outdoor enthusiasts. The network called itself the Wilderness Research Initiative, a name that masked activities that were anything but scientific. Detective Vasquez and Agent Santos found themselves face to face with a coordinated group of predators who had been operating across the western United States for over a decade, using wilderness areas as hunting grounds and underground networks as their infrastructure. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a disgraced psychiatrist who had lost her license after conducting unauthorized experiments on patients, had been running a similar operation in Utah's national parks. Her specialty was psychological manipulation and sensory deprivation techniques that she tested on hikers who disappeared from remote canyon areas. The detailed records she maintained showed at least 15 victims over 7 years, all attributed to hiking accidents by local authorities who never suspected foul play. Thomas Brennan, a former military contractor with expertise in surveillance and communications, had established operations throughout the Montana wilderness. His background in electronic warfare made him the network's technical specialist, responsible for the sophisticated monitoring equipment that allowed them to track law enforcement activities and coordinate their operations across state lines. His victims were typically experienced backcountry hunters and fishermen who had the skills to survive in remote areas but lacked the paranoia to detect skilled human predators. The third member of Walsh's network was perhaps the most disturbing. Jennifer Morrison, a former park ranger who had used her position within the National Park Service to identify potential victims and provide inside information about search and rescue capabilities. Her intimate knowledge of how missing person investigations were conducted had allowed the network to stay ahead of law enforcement for years, turning the very systems designed to protect wilderness visitors into tools for their predation. The chamber where they had made their final stand contained evidence of the network's most ambitious project, a research facility designed to study the psychological and physiological effects of long-term captivity in extreme environments. The Rahud abandoned mine provided the perfect laboratory, completely isolated from outside interference, with natural environmental stressors that could be manipulated and controlled. But it was the discovery of detailed victim files that revealed the true horror of their operations. The network had been systematically targeting people who fit specific psychological and physical profiles, conducting experiments that had no scientific validity beyond satisfying their sadistic curiosity about human suffering. Each victim had been studied, documented, and ultimately disposed of when they were no longer useful for the network's research. The tactical team's confrontation with the Wilderness Research Initiative ended in a firefight that echoed through the abandoned mine shafts like thunder. Walsh and his associates had prepared for this possibility, stockpiling weapons and explosives that they were willing to use rather than face capture. The battle in the toxic darkness below ground lasted for over 2 hours, with both sides using the mine's complex layout to their tactical advantage. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 members of the network were dead, including Dr. Hayes and Thomas Brennan. Jennifer Morrison had been wounded but taken alive, providing investigators with crucial intelligence about other potential network members who might still be operating in wilderness areas across the country. David Walsh had survived the confrontation, though he was severely injured and finally facing justice for years of crimes that had destroyed dozens of families. As rescue teams brought the survivors to the surface, Detective Vasquez realized that Sarah Chen's disappearance had uncovered Something far more extensive and horrific than anyone had imagined. The Wilderness Research Initiative represented a new kind of organized crime. Predators who used America's vast wilderness areas as hunting grounds and the isolation of outdoor recreation to conceal activities that challenged every assumption about how serial crimes were committed and investigated. What other networks might be operating in the shadows of America's most beautiful and remote places. 3 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance, long after the Wilderness Research Initiative had been dismantled and its surviving members imprisoned, a group of geology students from Colorado State University made the discovery that would finally close the circle on the most complex serial crime case in Colorado history. They were conducting field research on erosion patterns in the Maroon Bells area when one of them spotted something unusual protruding from a recently exposed riverbank. The hiking boot was weather-beaten and dirt-caked, its bright red laces still tied in the perfect double knot that Sarah had learned from her father during childhood camping trips. But what made this discovery extraordinary wasn't the boot itself. It was what forensic analysis would reveal about how it had been placed and why it had surfaced at this precise moment in time. Detective Vasquez, now promoted to lead the state's new Wilderness Crime Task Force, examined the boot at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's laboratory. The preservation was remarkable, considering it had allegedly been exposed to mountain weather for 3 years. The leather showed signs of careful treatment with preservatives, and the sole contained trace materials that didn't match the geological composition of the discovery site. Dr. Maria Fernandez, the forensic pathologist assigned to analyze the boot, made the discovery that would change everything investigators thought they knew about the case. Hidden inside the boot's tongue, barely visible without magnification, was a tiny electronic device no larger than a pencil eraser. The device was a GPS tracker with a built-in timer, programmed to activate after exactly 3 years and transmit a signal that would lead searchers to its location. The implications were staggering. Someone had placed Sarah's boot in that specific location, knowing that erosion patterns would eventually expose it and that the GPS signal would guide investigators to the discovery. But the timing wasn't accidental. It was precisely calculated to coincide with the 3rd anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, when media attention would be focused on the unsolved case. Agent Santos, who had continued investigating potential network members even after the Molybdenum King mine operation, analyzed the GPS device with growing concern. The technology was more sophisticated than anything David Walsh's group had possessed, suggesting that other individuals with advanced technical capabilities had been involved in the network's operations. The device contained encrypted data that required specialized equipment to decode, but when it was finally unlocked, it revealed information that made the entire investigation team's blood run cold. The encrypted files contained detailed surveillance reports on the families of all the network's victims, documenting their activities for months after their loved ones had been rescued or confirmed dead. Photos showed Sarah's parents at memorial services, Kevin Martinez's girlfriend at therapy appointments, and Amanda Foster's sister at support group meetings. Someone had been studying the long-term psychological effects of their crimes on the secondary victims, the families destroyed by their actions. But most disturbing was the discovery that the surveillance had continued even after the network's arrest and imprisonment. Recent photos showed Detective Vasquez leaving her apartment, Agent Santos picking up her children from school, and Dr. Watson giving lectures at the university. Someone was still out there, someone who had been connected to the Wilderness Research Initiative but had avoided capture when the network was dismantled. The boot's GPS device had been programmed with multiple waypoints, each corresponding to locations where additional evidence had been hidden. Following the digital breadcrumbs led investigators to supply caches that contained documentation of network activities that went back much further than anyone had suspected. Financial records showed funding from sources that investigators had never identified, and communication logs revealed contacts with individuals in other countries who were conducting similar operations. The most chilling discovery was a series of detailed plans for expanding the network's operations to other wilderness areas across North America. The documents outlined recruitment strategies for finding new members, techniques for avoiding detection by increasingly sophisticated law enforcement surveillance, and methodologies for conducting larger-scale experiments on missing persons. As investigators worked to decode the full scope of information hidden in the boot's GPS device, they realized that Sarah Chen's disappearance had been just the beginning of something much larger and more organized than they had ever imagined. The Wilderness Research Initiative wasn't an isolated group of predators. It was part of a broader network that spanned multiple countries and had been operating for decades. The person who had placed Sarah's boot with its hidden GPS device was still out there, still watching, still planning. And they wanted investigators to know that the game was far from over. But what message were they really trying to send with this carefully orchestrated discovery? The last waypoint programmed into Sarah Chen's boot led investigators to a location that made Detective Vasquez's stomach clench with recognition: the exact clearing where Sarah's scent trail had vanished 3 years earlier. But now, armed with sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and a full forensic team, they approached the site with the knowledge that someone had been orchestrating their discovery from the beginning. Buried 3 feet beneath the surface, investigators found a waterproof container that had been placed recently. The soil disturbance patterns showed it had been buried within the past 6 months. Inside the container was a letter written in the same precise handwriting they had found in David Walsh's journals. But the content revealed that Walsh had not been the mastermind behind the Wilderness Research Initiative. The letter was addressed to Detective Vasquez personally, indicating that whoever had written it had been studying her involvement in the case from the beginning. It contained details about her investigation techniques, her psychological profile, and even personal information about her family that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance. "Detective Vasquez," the letter began, "you have proven to be a worthy adversary, though you have only discovered a small fraction of our true capabilities. David Walsh and his associates were useful but expendable tools in a much larger experiment. The real research was never about the individuals we collected. It was about studying how law enforcement systems respond to coordinated disappearances across jurisdictional boundaries." The letter continued with chilling clinical detail, describing how the entire Wilderness Research Initiative had been designed as a test case for much larger operations. The writer explained that they had been studying response times, communication patterns between agencies, and the psychological profiles of investigators to develop methodologies for conducting similar operations on a much larger scale. Agent Santos analyzed the letter with forensic linguists and behavioral specialists, but their analysis revealed someone with advanced education in multiple fields: psychology, criminology, organizational behavior, and military strategy. The writing style suggested someone with significant experience in academic or research environments, but with practical knowledge of law enforcement and military operations that indicated field experience. The most disturbing revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs, where the writer thanked investigators for providing valuable data about American law enforcement capabilities. The entire Colorado operation had been conducted by foreign operatives who were testing techniques for disrupting American society through coordinated attacks on outdoor recreation areas that millions of people considered safe havens. "The individuals you rescued were never our primary objective," the letter continued. "They were simply test subjects in a study designed to understand how American communities respond to fear and uncertainty. The real experiment was observing how quickly trust in wilderness safety could be undermined, and how law enforcement resources could be stretched across multiple jurisdictions." Attached to the letter were detailed analyses of media coverage, public reaction, and changes in hiking patterns throughout Colorado since the disappearances began. The documents showed that the perpetrators had been studying the broader social impact of their crimes, measuring how fear could be weaponized to change behavior on a regional scale. But the letter's conclusion contained information that made the entire investigation team realize they had been part of a much larger intelligence operation from the beginning. The writer revealed that similar test programs had been conducted in wilderness areas across Canada, Australia, and several European countries, all coordinated by the same organization and designed to develop techniques for psychological warfare against civilian populations. The letter ended with a coordinates reference that led to one final cache, buried in a remote location in Rocky Mountain National Park. When investigators reached the site, they found documentation that proved the Wilderness Research Initiative had been funded and directed by a foreign intelligence service that specialized in asymmetric warfare against democratic societies. The cache contained evidence of operations planned for dozens of other wilderness areas across the United States, each designed to create the same pattern of fear and uncertainty that had gripped Colorado for the past 3 years. National parks, state forests, and popular recreation areas in every region of the country had been surveyed and mapped as potential sites for expanded operations. As Detective Vasquez reviewed the final documents, she realized that Sarah Chen's disappearance had uncovered an act of international terrorism disguised as random crime. The rescue of 3 victims had prevented a much larger operation designed to undermine Americans' confidence in their most cherished natural spaces and strain law enforcement resources to the breaking point. But the coordinates for dozens of planned operations suggested that other cells were still active, still preparing to execute similar attacks on American wilderness areas. The game was far from over. It was just beginning. What other wilderness areas across America were being surveilled by enemies who understood that terror didn't always come from bombs and bullets? The federal courthouse in Denver was surrounded by media crews and security personnel as the surviving members of the Wilderness Research Initiative faced trial for crimes that had redefined how America understood domestic terrorism. David Walsh, confined to a wheelchair due to injuries sustained in the mine confrontation, showed no emotion as prosecutors detailed the scope of his network's activities across multiple states and international connections. Jennifer Morrison, the former park ranger who had betrayed her oath to protect wilderness visitors, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed operational details that helped law enforcement understand how foreign intelligence services had recruited American citizens to carry out attacks designed to undermine public confidence in outdoor recreation areas. The trial revealed the full psychological profile of individuals who had been drawn to the Wilderness Research Initiative. Expert witnesses testified that the network had deliberately recruited people with backgrounds in law enforcement, military, service, and emergency response. Individuals who possessed the skills necessary to operate in remote areas while maintaining cover stories that allowed them to insert themselves into missing person investigations. Sarah Chen took the witness stand on the trial's most dramatic day, describing her nearly 2 years of captivity with a strength that silenced the packed courtroom. Her testimony revealed the psychological torture techniques the network had employed, designed not just to control their victims, but to study their responses to various forms of stress and isolation. She spoke with clinical precision about experiments that had been conducted on her and the other victims, treating them like laboratory subjects rather than human beings. "They never saw us as people," Sarah testified, looking directly at Walsh as she spoke. "We were data points in research that served no scientific purpose beyond satisfying their curiosity about human suffering and their desire to perfect techniques for psychological warfare." Kevin Martinez and Amanda Foster provided similar testimony, describing a coordinated system of psychological manipulation that had been designed to break down their mental resistance while documenting their responses for analysis. The victims' strength in facing their tormentors inspired a courtroom audience that included families of other missing persons who had never received answers about their loved ones' fates. The sentencing phase of the trial brought closure for the direct victims, but raised disturbing questions about other operations that might still be active. Federal prosecutors revealed that intelligence agencies had identified similar networks operating in wilderness areas across North America and Europe, suggesting that the Colorado operation had been part of a broader campaign of psychological terrorism against democratic societies. David Walsh received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, but his defiant statement before sentencing revealed the mindset of someone who believed his crimes served a larger purpose. He spoke of his victims as necessary sacrifices in research that advanced human understanding of survival psychology, and showed no remorse for the families he had destroyed. Jennifer Morrison's cooperation with investigators led to the identification of other individuals who had been recruited to support network operations. Her sentencing to 30 years in federal prison included testimony about recruitment techniques that targeted people with specific psychological vulnerabilities and professional backgrounds that made them useful for wilderness operations. But the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a much larger law enforcement effort to identify and neutralize similar networks before they could execute planned operations in other wilderness areas. The FBI established a new wilderness security task force that coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to monitor activities in remote areas that could be used for similar psychological warfare operations. Detective Vasquez, now serving as the task force's director, worked with agencies across multiple countries to develop new protocols for investigating disappearances in wilderness areas. The lessons learned from the Colorado case were being applied to prevent similar operations from taking root in other locations where millions of people sought recreation and solace in natural environments. Sarah Chen returned to her environmental law practice, but also became an advocate for wilderness safety and security, measures that could help prevent future victims. Her foundation funded research into techniques for detecting surveillance in remote areas and provided training for search and rescue volunteers to recognize signs of coordinated criminal activity. The case had forever changed how law enforcement agencies understood the intersection of international terrorism and domestic crime. What had begun as a missing person investigation had revealed a form of warfare that attacked the psychological foundation of American society, the belief that natural spaces provided refuge from the dangers of modern life. As Detective Vasquez reviewed intelligence reports about similar operations in other countries, she understood that the Wilderness Research Initiative represented just one component of a broader campaign designed to erode trust in the institutions and spaces that democratic societies considered sacred. The mountains of Colorado had revealed their secrets, but shadows remained in wilderness areas around the world where other predators might be preparing to turn humanity's love of nature into a weapon of psychological destruction. 5 years after Sarah Chen's hiking boot was discovered on that Colorado riverbank, Detective Vasquez stood at the same Maroon Bells trailhead where the nightmare had begun. The autumn aspen leaves painted the mountainsides in brilliant golds and crimsons, just as they had on the morning Sarah disappeared, but the wilderness no longer felt like the innocent refuge it had once seemed. The Wilderness Security Task Force had identified and dismantled 3 additional networks operating in national parks across the United States, preventing dozens of planned disappearances that would have terrorized outdoor recreation communities. Nationwide, international cooperation had led to similar successes in Canada, Australia, and several European countries, but intelligence reports suggested that other cells remained active in remote areas around the world. Sarah Chen had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed her experience into a mission that saved countless lives. Her foundation had developed technology that allowed hikers to maintain secure communication with monitoring centers even in the most remote wilderness areas, creating a safety network that could detect coordinated criminal activity before it escalated to abduction and torture. The hiking boot that had revealed everything now sat in a secure evidence locker at FBI headquarters, its GPS device having provided investigators with intelligence that led to the arrest of foreign operatives in 7 countries. The sophisticated timing of its discovery had been designed to showcase the reach and patience of international networks that viewed American wilderness areas as targets for psychological warfare. But perhaps the most important revelation had come from the psychological analysis of network members, which showed how foreign intelligence services had identified and exploited specific personality types that could be recruited for operations against their own citizens. The research had led to new security protocols for vetting individuals who sought positions in law enforcement, emergency response, and wilderness management agencies. Marcus Rivera had married Sarah Chen in a small ceremony at the base of the Maroon Bells, choosing to reclaim the location where their lives had been shattered by turning it into a symbol of resilience and healing. Their wedding was attended by the search and rescue teams, law enforcement officers, and federal agents who had risked their lives to bring Sarah home from the underground nightmare that had held her for nearly 2 years. Kevin Martinez had become a software engineer specializing in security systems for remote communication networks, using his technical skills to develop applications that could help future wilderness visitors avoid the kind of coordinated surveillance that had made him a target. His work had been adopted by search and rescue agencies across multiple countries, creating a global network of wilderness safety that made it much more difficult for predators to operate undetected. Amanda Foster had returned to nursing, but specialized in trauma recovery, working with victims of human trafficking and organized crime who needed specialized medical and psychological care. Her understanding of the long-term effects of captivity and psychological torture made her uniquely qualified to help other survivors rebuild their lives after experiencing horrors that most people could never imagine. As Detective Vasquez walked the same trail where Sarah had disappeared, she reflected on how a single missing person case had uncovered a form of terrorism that attacked the most fundamental aspects of American life: the freedom to find solace and recreation in natural spaces that had been considered safe for generations. The case had revealed that even the most remote and beautiful places in America were not immune to the reach of international networks that sought to undermine democratic societies through fear and psychological manipulation. The truth that Sarah Chen's boot had revealed was more terrifying than anyone could have initially imagined: that America's wilderness areas had become battlegrounds in a shadow war fought by enemies who understood that terror didn't always require bombs or bullets. Sometimes the most effective attacks targeted the spaces where people went to find peace, turning the healing power of nature into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. But the case had also revealed the extraordinary resilience of individuals and communities when confronted with evil that challenged their most basic assumptions about safety and security. The investigators, victims, and families who had confronted the Wilderness Research Initiative had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated forms of psychological warfare could be defeated by ordinary people who refused to let fear triumph over their fundamental humanity. The mountains of Colorado kept their secrets until they were ready to reveal the truth. And when that truth finally emerged from a weather-beaten hiking boot, it showed that sometimes the most important battles for democracy are fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the quiet places where people go to remember what makes life worth living. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because in a world where even our most sacred spaces can become hunting grounds for those who seek to destroy our way of life, every voice raised in defiance of terror becomes a victory for the values that define who we are as a people.